Great day, great night, wherever you are watching or listening in from. Welcome to another edition here of Crypto Happy Hour, and have a special guest on the line. Today it is at Crypto Ethan, or better known as Ethan. What's going on, man? How's it happening?
It's going well. It's going well. How are you?
Good. Appreciate you taking the time to join. And for anybody who isn't familiar, so I actually have a link in the description, number one, to Ethan's Twitter, but also to the last time Ethan was on the channel, which was, I believe, almost the exact literal top of the crypto market. I think it was January 15th of 2018. So it was basically the absolute top on the market, which is pretty freaking funny to think about. And I went back and watched some of the video with you on, and kind of maybe halfway through, we started talking a little bit about kind of what your thoughts on the market were, and you pretty much called the top and said we were completely overextended, and we might start to hit a couple different phases of despair, and start seeing some capitulation. So I thought that was pretty. Looking back, you nailed it. Which was pretty awesome. So good for you on that. But yeah, wanted to have you back on. I know, we've been trying to figure this out with your schedule for a while, but wanted to have you back on. Just get a feel for where your head's at, and also, take some questions and Q&A here as well. So I thought that'd be awesome to do.
Yeah, sure. So last time you had me on, it was about a year ago. Bitcoin had made its top in December. I was on in January, I think. And to be fair, I gave a little bit of a hedged call. I said, we don't really know where it's going to go from here, but my inclination is that the run doesn't have, much longer to go. And it turned out that didn't have any more to go at all.
No.
So far we've seen a pretty sharp pullback. I'm sure we're all painfully aware. And I think around now, it's interesting that you have me on again now, because I actually just started buying, not crazy, but I put, at least for me, was a substantial amount of money into it back in, I think, December, back when it hit its low.
Yeah, and I think we can kind of get into your thoughts on like where we are, and kind of where we've been, and maybe take a little bit of a recap as far as kind of just the market cycle as a whole. And for everybody who's watching right now, if you're listening, I'm going to turn this into a podcast later as well, but it is Crypto Happy Hour. So I got a black lager, the same one I had in the last episode. I've been on the black lager kick, so I'm going on with that again. And Ethan is 1 year older, but I don't know about the legal drinking age here, so we're
well, I am in London, but I have a very nice bottle of co-op water that I will be drinking throughout.
There we are.
But yeah, so I am in London though, studying abroad. Very good time here. Shout out LSE Frisbee. But yeah, so good time.
Awesome. Well, so yeah, kind of going to your point, having looked at the market, and I know you said you started buying a little bit in December. Do you think, I guess, high level question, do you feel like we've kind of bottomed out at this point, where we have Bitcoin sitting kind of mid 3,000s, and a lot of the basically the rest of the crypto market really following suit with Bitcoin? Do you feel like we've reached some level of a bottom, or do you think there's still room to go further? Where's your head at this point in time?
So I think we've reached more or less the bottom. I'm lucky that I got a pretty big fill in at 3150. I do think it's the bottom. I'm not sure if it's the exact bottom or not. I mean, that's really hard to pinpoint. I think if it's not the exact bottom, we're pretty damn close, because looking at past retracements, right? If we're going back, and I like to do this, I like to look back at the 2013, 2014 bubble and subsequent bust, and see sort of how that played out. And also look back at other smaller market cycles that happened before that in Bitcoin's history. And looking back to then, we saw about an 85% pullback from Bitcoin's all-time high in, I think, December 2013 to its all-time low in January 2015.
Yeah.
And I was trading back then as well, so I remember that. I remember how, if everyone felt. I remember what it felt like on Twitter. I remember kind of what the prevailing sentiment was. And back in December, it felt pretty dang similar. But I also want to note that the low of 3,000, roughly 3,000 that we hit back in December last year is about 85% from its all-time high of 20,000. And that was sort of where I had my eye on as we were going down. You know, we had a very strong support level at 6,000, but strong support levels were made to be broken.
Didn't hold?
No, it didn't. So I was sort of looking at potential pullback to maybe 4,000, worser case scenario, about 3,000. I didn't necessarily think, I wasn't like convinced fully that it was going to go all the way to 3,000 because I thought, okay, the Bitcoin market is more liquid, more well-established. There's more institutional money in the market. So I thought that there was going to be a little bit of a more mild pullback because I thought there was the money in the market was more less flexible, more inflexible, because you had institutions, you had larger players coming into the play who weren't going to be as deterred by these volatile prices. So I thought they were going to help to not only provide liquidity, but also sort of take some coins off the market that would otherwise be used more speculatively. But it seems like that hasn't come into play. We are at about an 85% pullback, which is roughly what we saw in 2014. We saw a mild bounce off the lows, but at least Bitcoin is starting to drift back towards those lows. Right now, I'm looking at 33.50 on Bitcoin, which is about $200 above the low. So I don't know if this is like the absolute low or not, but I'm pretty convinced that we are near the lows. And I'm pretty sure $1,000, anything like that is out of the cards. Like,
yeah, that's
the way
that's
I think about it.
It's funny as you say that. I'm looking at Morel and John Penn. Shout out, thanks for watching in too. Yeah, seeing 1,300, 1K, which that's still quite a ways. I mean, that's what 60+% down from where we are right now. So not saying that is out of the question by any stretch, but that would be a lot more pain across. And I think if we see a 60% downturn on Bitcoin, you're going to see altcoins go down 80+%. I would bet.
Yeah. And I think the approach, at least I take in situations like this, when you're looking at a more macro time frame, is to look less at precise levels on the charts and look more so at prevailing sentiment. And that's a tricky issue to deal with. I actually have a blog post out about it that talks about sort of how I treat sentiment analysis, because it is a very multifaceted tool. It's in my Medium. It's on my Medium account if you want to check that out. But basically, the way I think about this and the way that I recall it happening back in 2014, 2015, is basically what we saw when Bitcoin was at 6,000, or at least when it was coming down off its highs, when it was at 10,000, 12,000. People weren't really talking about how low it was going to go. It was more so talk about, okay, once this bear market is over, this dip is over, how high are we going to go? We saw calls still, even halfway through 2018, for 50,000, 100,000. I mean, you name it.
One parabolic.
Yeah. But now, as Bitcoin settled into its 6,000 range, people started to get a little bit more skeptical. Some people thought 6,000 was going to break. I would say that the majority probably thought that 6,000 was a solid level that was going to hold. But then when we broke 6,000, until about 5,000 or so, people thought, oh, this is a minor retracement. But then as we dipped lower, as we went to 4,000 and then ultimately just above 3,000, people started to change their narrative, right? People started to think, okay, how low can this go? And not just how low will it go, but will it go to zero? And that's when the question changed, right? Mm-hmm. The question wasn't, okay, when's the low? The question is this going to zero, or is it going to 1,000, 100, however low you want to say? And at that point, when people start saying things like that, you can sort of get a feel for what, the supply is looking like in Bitcoin, both the supply and the demand, actually. When people are overwhelmingly turning to despair, right? Or think that, okay, the low is not in, or let's say going to 1,000, what are the odds that they're invested in Bitcoin? Probably pretty low if they think it's going to go lower, right? If they're being kind of silent, sitting on the sidelines, they're probably not super heavily invested in Bitcoin, right? And also, I like to think, right, if we're at $3,000, how much supply out there, or at least like elastic supply, is there left, right? How many people are there really that are willing to sell at this price? Mm-hmm. Because we've been at about $3,000 for quite a while. It's about 85% from its highs. Most people are way, way down on their capital. Most people are way underwater on their investments. Even if they bought like halfway through 2017, they're still underwater if they just held. So the question really is how many, hodlers out there that are still willing to sell? And if the answer is very few, then you have a pretty good looking supply curve, right? Where people aren't really willing to sell at this price. So supply is sort of constrained, right? And at the same time, demand is also pretty bad. I'll be honest, demand is pretty bad. No one's really looking to buy Bitcoin right now, I guess, except for me and a few other people out there. But I think, looking at sentiment, and I'm not sure if I explained that the best, but looking at sentiment is sort of a good way to get a feel for, not wisdom of the crowds, but sort of looking at how the crowds are invested. And from there, looking at momentum, looking at flows, looking at, okay, where are we going to go from here, given that this is where, let's say, the majority of investors are positioned.
Yeah, and I think there's kind of going to that point too on sentiment, which is, I think, really interesting, especially when you're talking about crypto, because so much of this is psychological, so much of this is sentiment driven. There was a good tweet from Murad. It's at must.murad. I don't think I can actually be able to show it to you. I don't know if you've already seen it, but I'm showing it on the screen share right now. And it actually goes to, it's Murad talking and says this, he has a chart, which is actually the Bitcoin tweets historical chart of tweets per day. And you can actually see the run up from January of 2017, all the way into the peak of mid-December when we saw Bitcoin at $20,000. And there has really just been a straight downfall, kind of matching the Bitcoin price in 2018 to 2019. And we are at, according to Murad here, tweets about Bitcoin are at the same levels they were in 2014 and lower at any point than they were in 2016. Says this is basically an absolute disaster for the price in the midterm opinion. And to put into context, Murad is highly, highly bullish in the long term. But I do think it's really interesting too, because that was one of the big things that we had talked about in the past. When you were on last time, was we had talked a little bit about just kind of market cycles in general, and we had the whole Wall Street cheat sheet, and then some of the other kind of components around market sentiment. And right now, I think a lot of people still are like waiting for like capitulation, and I really do think that in my personal opinion, the vast majority of investors that came in December and January of 2017, 2018 have capitulated, have left the market. And a lot of the hype and interest around Bitcoin and cryptocurrency is kind of limited to the 176 crazy people that are on YouTube right now, the 3 people that are on Twitch, and I don't know how many people that are on no, obviously a lot more than that, but it's a pretty core group of people at this point in time that are kind of still left interested in the space, and even looking at kind of social sentiment. And I think Google Trends is another one. I mean, a lot can be said about that being a lagging indicator and not really something you can kind of base further decisions off of, but interesting nonetheless, I think.
Yeah, I mean, there's more than a few ways to actually go about like finding data for sentiment analysis. I do a little bit more subjective. Like you said, Google Trends is a little bit lagging, but they can still give you a good picture of, where we are relative to, I guess, further back historically. Mm-hmm. Like, for example, I do have the Murad tweet up right now, and it's a pretty good chart. It's a good find. But I think in terms of sentiment analysis, I take a little bit more of a subjective approach. So most of what I do is sort of focused on Twitter, because I think Twitter, I just like Twitter personally, and I think it is a good proxy for the investor base as a whole. I'm not sure pulling in like other platforms would really help. But what I do is I kind of, I have a lot of the like big accounts, I guess, followed. And, when they tweet or they post a call, sometimes I'll keep track of what their directional bias is. And I'll also go look at the replies and see sort of what the people who follow them are saying, or what the replies are saying, right? I like to see sort of if goalposts are shifting, right? Whether or not people are changing their opinions just because of new price data, right? And price data is important to consider, but price is price. Price is not fundamentals. Price is not it's surface level, right? So I think for those people who are waiting for capitulation, right, I have 2 questions. One is, what would you define as capitulation? Not necessarily just a level, but what would you define in terms of user base, tweet activity, media coverage? It's a whole package, right? What overall environment on top of price would you define as capitulation? And second of all, what did you define as capitulation 6 months ago, right? Back when Bitcoin was falling, right? Did you think that $6,000 or $3,000 was the low? Because I remember a lot of people saying, at least in passing, that, okay, we could hit $3,000, right? I wasn't seeing anything for $1,000. But now that we're actually at 3,000, I'm seeing a lot of people just completely shift their positions down 2,000, 1,000 or below, just because price is now at 3,000. The way I approach it is, hey, I saw, or a lot of us saw, you know, that Bitcoin was going to go lower, and I thought 3,000 was definitely in the cards. And now that we're at 3,000, I'm not shifting my position. I'm saying, this is amazing that we're here. This is a great price, and I'm buying. And so that's sort of how I'm approaching it. I'm not really shifting my opinions based on, you know, what price is doing. I think if you have, let's say, a wrong call, I think the Crypto Dog actually put a really good series of tweets out, I think earlier today or yesterday, talking about how he did sort of a 180 on an Ethereum price prediction because price sort of invalidated his previous thesis. And that makes a lot of sense, right? If price goes against where you thought it was going to go, then yeah, that makes a lot of sense to go ahead and revise, you know, your thesis and think, okay, where did I go wrong? But in this case, right, if you thought Bitcoin was going to hit 6,000 or 3,000, especially if you thought it was going to hit 3,000, because that was a pretty prevailing level that was out there, then why would you revise your opinion if it all played out to plan, right? Just because you're scared doesn't mean you should, you know, revise your opinion. And I'm not saying, you know, all in FOMO into Bitcoin right now. Obviously, please don't do that. Like, please don't do that. But
Ethan is providing you certified financial advice
at
the present time to
don't get me in trouble.
Put your entire life savings into Bitcoin and potentially Dentacoin. So you can throw that in writing, guys. So there's a good question here. Shout out Ricky Thompson. Appreciate that. So this is assuming we ever, or kind of, making the assumption that we ever go up again. But Bobby, ask Ethan how high Bitcoin needs to go to break this downtrend. Seems to be different for everybody. So looking at kind of where we are right now, do you think that there is a specific level that we can see that, you know, might actually provide some clear break of this downtrend that we've been on since 1984 at this point?
I don't know if one level is really going to do it. It's a multi-year trend, so it's not just, you know, one level. I think, though, if I did have to give one level, it has to be 6,000, right? If you look at the chart, like, since, what is it? I have the chart on a different screen here. So since about early February, $6,000 has been tested so many times as support, and it's held so many times. And if you look at the chart, right, it looks literally like you put a graph of, let's say, x squared, the parabola, against a graph of like y equals 0, right? And you kind of just squeeze Bitcoin as it, let's see if I can do this, right? As you squeeze Bitcoin as it goes below these two curves, that's what the chart looks like, right? So 6,000, that has to be the level that we, you know, if that breaks, then that would be a really good sign. But like I said, it's not just one level. That would be a really good indicator, but it's going to be a multi-year trend, right? And the way I'm looking at it is not that, you know, we're going to rise over the next 6 months or whatever, right? We could easily stay near these lows and below 6,000 for a year or two, honestly. Like, we might not see anything for a year or two. But I think if you're thinking, you know, will it ever go up again? Just maybe think back to why you got involved in the first place, right? Maybe think less about the price action. If you're making an ever statement, then you have to think about the fundamentals, right? Think about why you got in. Did you really believe in technology? Is that why you got in? That's kind of why I got in. That's probably why you got in as well. But just think about that. Don't let price sort of cloud your long-term
super honest.
Right? Yeah.
So taking a look at some of these questions here as well, and kind of going to that point too. So you said, hey, if we're here at this level, this $3,000 level for a year or 2 years, that's certainly possible. Definitely is. Do you feel like, kind of some steadiness at this level, similar to what we saw at that $6,000 mark that we were hanging around at for, I think it was probably the better part of like 3 to 4 months, really, where there was just really minimal volatility at all. The daily volatility on Bitcoin was kind of tiny in comparison to what it traditionally has been. Do you feel like that would be healthy for the I guess Bitcoin or trading ecosystem if we do see some just kind of overall support here without any massive fluctuations to the upside? Any thoughts on that?
I think that would be. I think sort of how 2015 and 26 or the first half of 2016 sort of fleshed out a lot of the bad actors or people who were just in it for the money in crypto. I think we're going to see something similar to that in 2019 and potentially 2020 as well. When price is moving, it doesn't matter if it's going up or down. You can make money on it, right? Because you can use leverage. But if it's ranging or if it's flat, if it's chopping, then you got to be really, really skilled at technical analysis to make money in that environment. And there's some people who can, but most people can't. And especially with, if you're trying to capitalize on like the longer term, like cryptocurrency market cycle, let's say you want to get like a job in like the job blockchain space, let's say, then it's going to be really, really hard because as companies sort of adjust to, this prolonged depression, people are going to continue to get laid off. Even if the price doesn't go down, we're going to see more miners shutting off. We're going to see more people getting laid off. And I hate to say it, I really do. Like, this is not good stuff.
Yeah.
But it's what we're going to end up seeing if Bitcoin stays where it is. And going back to sort of what you said about finding support at this 3,000 level, Mustap Murad actually did put out a tweet saying that he thinks like 1,000 is likely. I respect him. He's got some charts that back that up. And right now, I don't personally think that's likely. But I think if we form a similar setup, right? If we continue to test 3,000 and we continue to form lower lows in this past range we've built up over the past 2 months, then that wouldn't be a good sign. And I very well could be wrong here, and I could very well lose money on my Bitcoin buys. But overall, I'm comfortable buying Bitcoin unlevered at this price.
Gotcha. Yeah, totally. And so one question here, I'm just pulling it back up. Where did it go? So this is from Nasty J. What's up, dude? In any market, conventional herd thinking is almost always opposite of the actual price action, with most people calling for $1,000. Doesn't it seem unlikely? I will get to another question here in 1 second. Shout out to Full-Time Geek for that super chat there. But I do think this is an interesting question because we've seen this a little bit on the upside. We saw this a ton on the upside, where like you talked about, it was the $50,000, the $100,000 calls, the John McAfee. We're in a new paradigm, and it's literally mathematically impossible for this bubble to break. Yada yada yada. And it was just like the higher Bitcoin went, the stronger the degree of conviction that it was going to continue to go up till the moon. And kind of since the $6,000 mark, I feel like the bears had been kind of in a similar level, and then obviously they were rewarded when Bitcoin cut another 50% to essentially where we are right now. But now that, like you said, now that we're at that $3,000 mark, you're hearing more and more calls for 2,000, 1,000, 1,300, whatever it might be. I do think it is, interesting to see the degree of conviction now on the bearish side that is somewhat matching what we saw on the way up in 2017, maybe like very, very early 2018. Any thoughts on that at all?
Yeah. So I think the person who made that comment makes a good point in the sense that the herds are usually wrong, but you have to be very careful when you time that, right? Because people would thought Bitcoin was going to the moon when Bitcoin was at 10,000, right? So if you had, let's say, shorted that, you would have been bankrupt because it had gone up. Even if you had shorted with like 2x leverage, you would have gone bankrupt probably. So you have to be careful with just general going against the crowds. Sentiment analysis can give you a good sort of general idea for what's going on, but in terms of like pinpointing levels, it's not the most precise tool, mainly because it's very subjective, and data is very reliable data is hard to get. Mm-hmm. So it's the right idea, and I talk about it in my blog again. If you want to get like a more sort of detailed explanation. Yep. But yeah, so I think people shifting their goalposts down to, let's say, 2,000, 1,000 now that their target's been hit, rather than just scaling in. I suspect most people have scaled out since Bitcoin broke 6,000, and I don't want to rag on them. Like, people have bills to pay, and that's totally understandable. But in terms of like a trade plan, then it's not really a great indicator.
Yeah, totally. And just real quick, full-time geek, if you thanks for that super chat, appreciate that, man. If you want to just follow me on Steam, and it's Steemit at Crypto Bobby, just no underscores, straight Crypto Bobby. So you're good to go there, man. Looking at some more of these questions here, the herd is always right. I don't know about that. The herd is coming, and it's the institutional herd, and we can talk a little bit about that. So you had mentioned that previously. There's been some comments around the ETFs, and a lot of the components around what I think led up to a lot of the hype in 2017. And part of that was futures launching with the CME and CBOE. I think that was almost, if we look back, I forget which one, if that was the CME or the CBOE who launched the futures first, but that the run up to the futures launch was almost the exact top of Bitcoin, which is pretty crazy, and it's really been on a tumble ever since. But where is like the institutional, I guess, adoption, or quote unquote institutional adoption in your mind? Do you feel like that is a necessity for us to see a market improvement from a price standpoint? Do you think there's any validity to that, or is it something that you think is kind of a mythical unicorn at this point in time?
I don't know if it's a unicorn, but it's not going to be a herd. It's going to be a very slow trickle. Institutions aren't going to rush in at once. They're not going to push the price up. Why would they do that? They're giving themselves the worst price. They're going to be, if they do try and enter Bitcoin, then it's going to be very, very slow, very methodical. These people know what they're doing. Like, they wouldn't have that much money if they didn't know what they were doing with the markets. So I think with institutions, yeah, it's a slow process, but it is starting. With regard to the ETF specifically, I don't really see the hype behind it, and maybe that's because I'm not like some sort of ETF expert.
Yeah.
But there's plenty of on ramps to get exposure to crypto right now. For retail people, it's pretty easy to open an account with Coinbase or Gemini and buy some Bitcoin. For institutions, there's a ton of institutions or funds that will, gladly deal you crypto or get you involved. Perhaps it's a little harder, but institutions aren't really, at least I don't think institutions are really buying ETFs on the open market to gain exposure.
No spot long Bitcoin positions. I don't know what you're talking about.
No, they're not on BitMEX, believe it or not.
Actually, some of the institutions are just offshore entities, which is pretty crazy. At least the high frequency traders are.
Yeah,
it's pretty funny.
The whales. I don't know about like major institutions, but yeah. But yeah, so they can get in right now if they want to. I think on ramps to make it easier. So for example, let's say if an investment bank, like I know Goldman shelved their plans to open a crypto desk, maybe some other large banks are thinking of doing so. That would be great, because trading desks are actually, that doesn't mean the bank themselves are buying the asset, but that means that the clients they work with, and the clients they work with are other institutions. That means that those clients now have an easier way to get Bitcoin. They can go through Goldman or some other bank, which is a trusted intermediary for them, and buy Bitcoin. And that's a lot safer, a lot easier, gives them a lot more peace of mind. So I think a crypto desk opening up, or multiple crypto desks at multiple banks, would be a really, really good thing for the ecosystem. Really, really good thing for the price, at least. Maybe not the ecosystem, but the price.
Yeah, totally. Now, I think it's going to be interesting to watch that just kind of process develop, because I do think, it's been really interesting just watching like not only the price of the assets in the crypto space, and you had alluded to it earlier, but the layoffs. I mean, we've seen layoffs at you've seen layoffs at Steemit, you've seen layoffs now or potential layoffs, I think, at NEM. I don't really know all that much about NEM, but apparently they're going to have massive layoffs. Hosho, which is a smart contract auditing company, doesn't have any token or anything like that, but laid off 80% of their staff because of the need for smart contract auditing. Died down quite a bit. Like across the board, there's been a number of layoffs. I think that'll continue to increase. Liqui essentially went out of business. Like all types of stuff. But then at the same point in time, there are still some companies getting really more traditional VC funding. Still some companies growing at this point in time. So like, who is going to be able to, a lot of this comes down to who is going to be able to survive the bear market. And when you look at having the bear market. One thing I think to think about as a
Hey, Bobby?
Yeah,
is your mic working?
Yeah, can you hear me? Hold on. Hey, can you hear me?
Hey, yeah.
Sorry about that.
I was worried with my sound.
My bad, dude. So yeah, when you look at what when you look at where we are at this point in time, I think this was like an interesting discussion on Pomp's podcast, which I actually really like a lot. And he had Nikhil from CoVenture. He had Atit and Nikhil, but he had Nikhil on, and he asked Nikhil a question, and this was something that they actually disagreed with. So I thought this was kind of an interesting statement too, where Pomp and Nikhil were essentially disagreed, where Nikhil thought that the companies that some of the companies that raised the most amounts of money were much more likely to survive this bear market than a lot of the companies that kind of raised a smaller amount of capital. And Pomp essentially argued the counter side of that, companies that were not as aggressive with the $50-100 million ICOs, $200 million ICOs, whatever they might have been. Those companies that haven't released products or kind of haven't done anything notable, they are very less likely to actually survive a bear market. And we're starting to see that with some of these other projects as well. They might have raised a ton of money, but either mismanaged treasuries or whatnot. But it's going to be really interesting just in the long run, outside of like thinking institutional, but just infrastructure in the space. If this is a bear market, or just if this market does last in a sideways pattern with, let's say, ETH at $100 and Bitcoin at $3,000 for 2 years, it's going to cause a lot of companies to I think blow up, because a lot of them just did not have this in their projections when they were raising money or spending money or anything like that.
Yeah, I think it goes both ways, but I think, like I said, it goes both ways. So basically, if you're a smaller company and you raised less capital, it depends why you did that, right?
Yep.
If you couldn't get the capital, that's one reason. But if you were just, if that means that you were more likely to tighten your belt on the expenses, right? So if you raised, it doesn't matter how much you raised, if you have a lower rate of spending, then you're going to be better off and more likely to survive. So if those companies that raise less capital are more likely to tighten their belts, either because of that or whether that reflects like the nature of the founders or whatever their fiscal habits, then that means they're more likely to survive. I mean, generally you would think, yeah, those who raise the most capital are going to be most poised to survive, right? But what if you're running, or what if you set up some sort of massive organization with 1 million employees and your expenses are through the nose, and maybe you kept most of your treasury in Ethereum or other cryptocurrencies, which are now down 80-90% from their highs when you raised when you raised that money.
Yeah,
like that's a massive loss, and I guarantee you none of these companies forecast this in their projections, probably not even as a worst case scenario. But I would be inclined to say that those who voluntarily raised less capital, like if you only took like 5 million and you could have raised 50 or whatever, just because you wanted to kind of cap it, then you're probably doing better off, because that means you're probably not just trying to grab as much money as you can. And you're probably more likely to kind of tighten your belt and be a little more responsible with it. That's just my 2 cents. I mean, obviously it differs from company to company, but it would be interesting to see data on that, actually. It'd be really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And a couple points too. So a lot of questions if Ethan is my son. Yes, he is. He's just a few years younger than me, or I don't know, 10.
Adopted.
I don't know.
Adopted.
Yeah. He's my adopted son. So yes, Ethan is my son at this point in time. I've adopted him, even though I don't think he's at the adopting age anymore. But Eunice, I'm happy to address this allegation. He is my son. And then next question, Stefan, what's up, dude? Hope all is well, man. Good to see you in the chat as always too. And I don't know if you saw this, but there was some pretty cool news about Abra today, allowing essentially. So Abra is really, I think Abra is probably, if you guys aren't familiar, so number one, Abra has a really, really slick app. So if you guys haven't used Abra, I would recommend checking it out. Abra has a really, really slick app. But Abra is essentially allowing you to purchase really derivatives of derivatives of stocks with crypto. So whether it's derivatives of the S&P 500 or Facebook or whatever it might be. But the way in which they do this is they actually don't even KYC you if you are depositing with Bitcoin, or I forget the other alternatives. It might be Ether or Litecoin or something like that. But they're actually the way in which that they're legally structured. It's super fascinating stuff. So I would check it out. I might do a full video on this at some point in time, because I think the way in which that they conduct their business is something that is really, really interesting, and I think a lot of you guys might enjoy that as well. But did you catch that news at all?
I see it now. No, I hadn't heard of Abra before. That sounds cool. That sounds really cool. I hope it's legal, because I know there was an exchange called One Broker that allowed people to do very similar things, and go to onebroker.com if you want to find out what happened.
Yeah, it's an FBI seizure page. I'll go with the spoil on that one. It's an FBI seizure page, but if you go to One Broker. I do think so. It is interesting there. I do think one thing that is kind of like Bill, who's the CEO of Abra, has been around in the Bitcoin space for a while. I actually think I could probably get a referral link. I'd love to send you one, Eunice. I'd love to send you a ref link, because I've used it and it's actually pretty legit. But his background is like, I think he was like 20 years ago was in like the CIA, or was like a software engineer for the CIA, and was like one of the original employees at Netscape, and like just in the internet business for a really long time. So there's a lot of like really fascinating stuff that Abra does in the way that they've like constructed their business. They are like by no means like a fly by night kind of like One Broker-esque type organization. So probably worth just at a very high level like a full video on, but I probably don't have the full I don't have the full breakdown of it right now.
Fair. That's cool. That's cool. I don't know much about it, but that's cool. It's like Robinhood sort of.
Yeah, essentially it's somewhat similar to that. Stefan, I see some kind of some comments there, I think, from the CEO. But if you guys have, trying to pop through some of these questions here. If you have any specific questions from Ethan outside of me avoiding child support for Ethan, he's at an expensive college right now, so I've been trying to avoid that as much as possible. Tuition is not cheap, so I will. He's taking out student loans for those. So
Anything else, or?
Yeah, just popping through. We'll take two more questions here. You got a minute?
Yeah, of course.
Outside of when you're growing your beard,
looks really bad. Don't ask me. It looks really bad. I just shaved today. Looks awful when I grow it out.
So we'll pull. Let's see here. So one fairly interesting question here. Have you ever given any thought to how, I'm going to say it says this, but I'll say the cryptocurrency just industry or Bitcoin as a whole could potentially not work out in our favor, as in the price could keep just really going down, and anything that could make this whole thing go up in flames? Is there anything when you look at putting money into Bitcoin, putting money into cryptocurrency, that you feel like is really just like the either the black swan event that would take this all down and make your $3,000 buys go to zero? Does anything kind of strike you as extremely realistic on that standpoint?
The apocalypse. I mean, yeah, there's a few things on that level that would, if the U.S. government and like Europe banned Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies, that would probably tank the price. If there was a critical vulnerability found in Bitcoin, that would tank the price for sure. I mean, outside of that, like, there's no really doomsday scenarios that could really tank the price. Mm-hmm. I mean, it has a value proposition that hasn't really changed over the past 10 years. I mean, just because it goes back to what I was saying, like just because the price is down doesn't mean like we have to get all doom and gloom here. Like it's still the same asset as it was 2 years ago.
Yeah.
And better, arguably, because Lightning Network and other things are coming along. But I mean, in terms of like the crypto space as a whole, I mean, if you talk about like blockchain technology and smart contracts, yeah, that might not work out. That very much might not work out. If you look at daily active users for most smart contracts, they're through the floor. They've always been through the floor. CryptoKitties was the only successful one, and that slowed down the Ethereum network. Like, I don't know. I'm not bullish on smart contracts at all. I mean, maybe I don't understand them fully, but I get the gist, and it just seems like a complicated and expensive way to do something that you could easily do with a trusted counterparty with little to no downside. I mean, if you're talking about that, then possibly. If you're talking about Bitcoin and like cryptocurrency, the actual currency, I think there's a very solid value proposition there that might not manifest unless like fully manifest unless there's a currency crisis. So it's manifesting in Venezuela right now, right? You see a lot of Venezuelans who luckily have access to cheap petrol and electricity because they have a ton of oil. They're mining Bitcoin, and that's how they're managing their finances. That's how they're bringing in hard capital. So it works for them. But in terms of like in developed nations, I think if technology like the Lightning Network comes along, if it becomes not only cheaper, but it becomes easier on the user's end to buy and sell things with Bitcoin. So if the UI gets there, if merchants understand Bitcoin, if it can be simplified, if it can be marketed, those would all be things. Usability would really bring value to Bitcoin, and not usability in the sense of can I use it, but why should I use it?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm laughing. I don't know if this is your buddy Scalus28, but he had some funny comments about you and your ex-girlfriend Sarah in the YouTube comments. I don't think that's actually a real person, but it's pretty funny. But no, I think looking at what you said, I think that there's a couple different interesting points. I think Bitcoin as a whole. And right now, there's a lot of I think that it's interesting because with the price action as it is, I think there's a lot of just like hostility in the community because realistically, everybody's wrecked. Bitcoiners specifically are less wrecked than anybody who's been big on an altcoin because you've gotten, Bitcoin's down really whatever, 75, 80%, whatever it might be, whereas most altcoins are down 90, 95%, probably plus some. But when you are when I'm thinking about Bitcoin and then to looking at where Ethereum is right now as well, there's a lot of arguments now. It seems like at least the people I follow on Twitter between Bitcoiners, between folks with Ethereum, or I don't know if we call them Ethereum maximalists, whatever you want to call them. But I do think that they could possibly coexist, and I do think Ethereum is starting to actually when you look at the DApp users as a whole too, DApp users are it's very minimal. You go to DApp Radar, there's not many people. And then if you can go to EOS or Tron, and there's a possibility that EOS and Tron are faking those users or whatever it might be. But Ethereum DApp users is pretty minimal. But you look at the amount of money that's involved within certain things like MakerDAO, CDPs, and compound finance, the amount of Ethereum that's locked up there. I do think that gets really interesting. And I think that there's kind of I think it's funny because you on Twitter you got Pomp with long Bitcoin, short the bankers. I do think in that case it's almost long Bitcoin, short the central bankers. But I don't think that in some cases Bitcoin necessarily disrupts the JP Morgans or the Goldman Sachs as much as maybe a smart contract, whether it's Ethereum or something else comes along. But there's some really interesting implications of decentralized lending or something like that. Right now with MakerDAO CDP, you get a 0.5%. You get essentially a loan for 0.5% annual interest. Granted, that's tied to the price of Ether, or it's collateralized to the price of Ether, which has dropped 90%. So you might be super, super collateralized. But it's, I think it's you have Bitcoin that is very much a realistic possibility to hurt a lot of central banks, and rightfully so, because central banks have been a kind of a plague on humanity in some cases. But then you also have maybe, and this is at a very high level, maybe, I think it's both a maybe, but potentially smart contract platforms, whether it's Ethereum or something else, that could have a cool kind of impact on what happens with like kind of just banks as a whole. So that'll be, I think, fun to watch. But last question here too. So one thing somebody talked about, and I think we can expand this question, but if you look at ETH, do you chart that against Bitcoin or USD? But even outside of that, as a whole, we had talked about this in the last the last time you were on the channel, looking at Bitcoin versus the altcoins, because they kind of move in sometimes separate directions. Has that changed for you at all recently? Like when you look at how Bitcoin moves versus how altcoins move in the market, like how do you look at the separate, or like the disparity between the two? Do you think there is any type of disparity at all there with how Bitcoin moves versus how altcoins move, and how you might chart one versus the other?
They move in similar directions, not always, but most of the time. In general, just looking at the charts, it seems like altcoins are about maybe 6 months ahead of the market cycle when compared with Bitcoin. And it's also supported by the fact that altcoins, most of them, I think, peaked in, what was it, like May or June of 2017, whereas Bitcoin took another half year to peak after that.
Yep.
So I think they're a little bit ahead of Bitcoin, but what we've seen with altcoins actually could support not necessarily a bullish case, but at least a non-bearish case for Bitcoin, because we've seen a lot of them over the past, I don't even know, 3 months. Some of them have formed a pretty solid bottom. Most of them aren't really trending down anymore. They haven't made new lows in at least a month, probably more of them. For more of them, it's a few months. And that's really what you want to see, right? Because assets don't just move up and move down. There's a lot of consolidation that takes place as well, and a lot of bottom forming, a lot of entry and exits. Before Bitcoin can have another run up, it's got to consolidate near the lows.
Mm-hmm.
It's got to be so old money can flush out, new money, if it's interested, can have a chance to enter, right? And then over time, once we've seen this overweight supply flushed out, then maybe we can see another rise. Once more coins are being held by people who are not hodlers necessarily, but are, in it for at least a longer term, maybe we can see a rise. And that's true in all markets, right? I mean, if you look at, I don't have the chart in front of me, but if you look at, like, I'm sure tech in the 2000s, right? After 2000, it was probably near its lows for quite a while before making any real moves. Same with Bitcoin. I mean, back in 2015, early 2016, it was between $200 to about $500-$600 for a year and a half. And that was after a high of $1,400-$1,200, something like that. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, what the picture that altcoins are painting right now is bullish, sort of, in and of itself, but it's also makes Bitcoin look good too.
Yeah, totally. No, that's I think that's it's a pretty interesting point too. And Reynaldo, real quick, sorry I missed that before. I think I put my public ID for my Lightning node and address within the chat. So let me know if you missed that, Reynaldo, if you're still on the line. But yeah, if you want to test out tippin.me with Lightning, that'd be awesome. Let me know how that works out. But I guess, at this point in time, I know it's probably somewhat late in wherever you might be right now, so I don't want to keep you from studying or running about town, whatever you might be up to. But I appreciate you taking the time, man. If you guys are unfamiliar or don't follow Ethan on Twitter, it's at CryptoEthan. So definitely do so. But hopefully we can get you on earlier than a year, because it was over a year since the last time you were on the channel. And hopefully this time you're right again, because last time, like we said before, Ethan said we're basically at the top, and yeah, this is looking a little bit frothy, and now things might be looking a little bit more realistic here, and we might be having a conversation hopefully with Ethan in the future again sometime, where we can talk about how he was dollar cost averaging in before before things started to move in a positive direction, and we're not all poor again. So
thanks for having me, Bobby. It's always good to talk with you, and thanks, chat, for the good questions.
Yeah, appreciate it, everybody. Thank you for the good questions. Appreciate all the trolls as well. Love you all. I hope you guys have a good one. Peace, everybody.